Good afternoon again, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon in particular to the listening and viewing public of Trinidad and Tobago and Trinidad. Welcome back to these consultations on the Tobago Self Government Bill and the Tobago Constitution Amendment Bill. We are here with you again, continuing our consultations on these two pieces of legislation. And I'd like to start by asking members of the committee to introduce themselves once more. And I'm starting with the members in Trinidad.
Foster Cummings, member.
Rudranath Indar Singh, member.
Gillian John, member.
Good afternoon, everyone. Renuka Sagram Singh Suklal, member.
Good afternoon, everyone. Shampaka Jo, member.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome again. Nigel Freitas, member.
Good afternoon, Maria Dillon Remy, member.
Good afternoon, Clarence Rambarat, member.
Good afternoon, everyone tuning in remotely, not from Tobago, but from Trinidad remotely. Faris Azrawi, member.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We also have members from Dr. Varma Dayal Singh and Mr. Dinesh Rambali. They cannot be with us at this time, but they've been here all day until now. Thank you very much. And now I'd ask the stakeholders who are with us to introduce themselves. Thank you.
President, good afternoon. Are you hearing us loud and clear?
Yes, we are. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, and pleasant good evening. Good afternoon to each and everyone. On this side, as a part of our team, we have Ingrid Melville, legal counsel and a consultant who have led the legal aspect of the discussions to this stage. We also have Kwesi Devines on my right-hand side, who has made representation on a number of different occasions to the committee. And then yours truly, Tracy Davidson Celestine, political leader, and also Tobagonian.
Thank you very much.
And also there
are other people, I think.
And also virtually, we have Ansel Dennis, current Chief Secretary of the Tobago House of Assembly. We also have Chairman of the People's National Movement, Mr. Stanford Calendar. We should also have Mr. Orville London, former Chief Secretary of the Tobago House of Assembly, including as well Mr. Kelvin Charles, former Chief Secretary, as well as perhaps General Secretary, Ms. Yolanda George. And there should be others such as Mr. Wendell Berkeley and Ms. Ayana Webster Roy as well.
Thank you very much, Assemblyman Davidson Celestine. And I'll invite you now to make your opening remarks, please.
And thank you very much for the opportunity to give our presentation to the Joint Select Committee in what we consider a very important exercise. Of course, you would know Tobagonians have been fighting for self-determination. We have been fighting for an enhanced arrangement between Trinidad and Tobago for some time. And so I want to use this opportunity to commend the committee for its effort thus far. And we are of the view that the Parliament is, of course, fulfilling its obligation and its mandate, which is that of attempting to ensure that the people of Tobago achieve self-determination. And so we are hoping that you would help us in the exercise of promoting, of supporting, and of course, achieving those objectives that we have been fighting for the longest while now. I just want to say at the outset that we are not here to bash in any way. We are not here to criticize. Of course, we are here to offer constructive criticism. We're also not here to seek perfection in the bill and even in the discussions, but we have the view that there are merits of the bill that we endorse, but at the same time, we are equally concerned that there are some fundamentals that we are not prepared to negotiate on. And so those positions we are going to articulate very forcefully in this particular exercise. And we do hope that those expressions be taken on board. We are very clear that from this end, that we are not asking for independence, nor are we asking for cessation in this particular exercise. We have the view that we have gone past any discussion having to do with a federal system for the island. As a matter of fact, all of us, every Tobagonian on this island, we have been clamoring for a relationship with Trinidad, which can give us the assurance that we will have equality of status, which can give us the assurance that we can have greater administrative and even legal responsibilities. Of course, in that arrangement, we have been asking for greater fiscal independence and of course, equal opportunities for us here in Tobago when compared to the opportunities that exist in our sister isle Trinidad. And so as we put forward our expressions, as we put forward our considerations, we are saying that we also want to take into consideration that those desires that we have should not in any way be affected by any national parties and politics, which of course can stymie our growth and even our progress. And so in that vein, whatever is captured in this bill must not only achieve the fundamental tenets, but it must be clearly articulated, it must be unambiguous, and of course, our desires must be provided for in the Constitution, which is what we have been talking about. And so in this particular exercise, I'm going to again introduce the legal counsel and the consultant who have brought us to this stage from the Tobago House of Assembly to share with you her thoughts. And then I will come back in to indicate areas where we have or discomfort, as well as Kwesi, who has been with the committee making presentations for some time now.
Ms. Melville. Thank you very much, Assemblyman Davidson Celestin. Ms. Melville.
Good afternoon, Chairperson of the committee, members of the committee, the audience listening and viewing. Madam Chairperson, I'm not sure if I'm within the frame.
Ms. Melville, you can continue.
Chairperson, we are grateful that the Joint Select Committee has reached at this point. In fact, as leadership is always contextual, I think that in this regard, we are on the cusp. And at this point in time, we in Tobago and in Trinidad and Tobago at large are called upon to carefully consider the two bills which are available to us from the Joint Select Committee.
Can I just indicate that we're not seeing Ms. Melville? So perhaps you can switch with her, please.
Forgive the technology.
Chairperson, am I more visible to you? Thank you. At this point in time, Chairperson, if I may continue, having looked at the bills, the Constitutional Amendment Bill 2020, as well as the Tobago Island Government Bill 2021, I must say that they are progressive when compared to the existing legal framework. However, at variance with what would have been submitted, and so in that regard, there are some limitations. So having listened to the committee this morning, I would just like to raise a few issues. This morning, Mr. Hochoy Charles would have mentioned that while the issue of equality was listed in the bill, the reality of the draft legislation is quite different. Indeed, Madam Chairperson, arriving at the juncture where we were able to submit a draft bill to the Parliament was not an easy road. It involved many decades of consultation, research, and work by different groups in Tobago, as well as in Trinidad. If we are to look at it from the written legal perspective, starting in 1977, when the Honorable A.N.R. Robinson would have moved the motion in Parliament, there has been a lot of research from since then. We had the 1980 Act of Parliament, which was followed by the present Tobago House of Assembly Act, which we are now governed under, as well as the constitutional amendment. However, following that, between 1996 and 2013, there were several initiatives. The Tobago House of Assembly moved a resolution in 2005 regarding the issue. There was also the Clark Draft Constitution in 2006, which set out a working document on constitutional reform in 2009. And a critical element in that was the Tobago constitutional question. The Dumas team was established. There was also the Tobago Forum for Consensus on the Constitution, which was chaired by Mr. Christo Gift, eminent attorney at law, senior counsel in Tobago. There was the Prince Committee, headed by the late John Prince, which was convened in 2007, and which worked assiduously through the length and breadth of Tobago, ending with final proposals to the THA in September 2011. In 2012, the People's Partnership Government would have laid before the Parliament a green paper, and at the same time, while the green paper was sent out for public consultation, there was a THA commission established in 2012. That commission was led by eminent Tobagonians such as Mr. Alan Richards, Dr. Vern Allen, Mrs. Deborah Moore Miggins, Mr. Gilbert Peterson, Senior Counsel, and there was a report. That was the report which Mr. Hochoy Charles would have referred to this morning. As following that report, there was a motion moved at the Signal Hill Secondary School, and that motion would have dealt with certain non-negotiables which Tobagonians felt must be included in the legislative framework to advance development of Tobago. In 2013, the Forum of Political Parties was convened. And upon the convening of that forum, in fact, it was that forum which would have also laid the commission report at Signal Hill in 2014. And so there were several initiatives ongoing at the same time. The Green Paper consultations, as well as that the work of the Forum of Political Parties. Madam Chairperson, people through the length and breadth of Tobago would have made contributions, which was all condensed in the Constitution Amendment Tobago Self Government Bill 2016, which was passed in the Tobago House of Assembly, a bill which I know the Honorable Attorney General would reiterate was ultra-virus, but it was a bill which established the principles and which the Tobago people felt were non-negotiable in terms of constitutional amendment for Tobago. This bill was later sent back to Cabinet in 2018 following another consultative process, and it was that bill which I believe would have been taken to the Joint Select Committee for consideration. By the time the bill reached the Joint Select Committee, however, there were certain amendments. So in speaking at this point in time regarding the bill, I will speak to the variance between the bills submitted from Tobago in 2016 and 2018 and the present bills which are before us. Indeed, the bills which the Joint Select Committee have proposed
me? Okay. What we would like for this consultation is if you could take us to the concerns that you have in the Constitution Amendment Bill and the concerns that you may have in the Tobago Island Government Bill. That is what we're going to be discussing, not the comparison necessarily between the 2018 bill and this bill. What we need are what are the concerns that you have with regard to the two bills that are before us, the two drafts that are before us for discussion.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair. Are you hearing me, Madam Chair?
I am.
Thank you. Madam Chair, you mentioned the points of concern, but I must also speak to a few areas of commendation because there are positives in the redrafted legislation. In terms of the structure, the governance structure, particularly the legislature which is proposed, it is unicameral, but it provides, it is broad enough to allow for oversight, and with the functioning of established committees would be able to go a long way towards advancing governance in Tobago. However, Madam Chair, there are some areas that while they are in tandem with the desires of the people of Tobago, that might have further room for, I don't want to use the word improvement, but there are certain areas which I believe that can be sharpened. I do not know if the political leader would like to go through the differences now or whether I should continue.
Go ahead, Ms. Melville.
Very well. One of the issues for consideration is the definition of Tobago. Having looked at the definition which is stated on page 3 of the Constitutional Amendment Bill, I am concerned that it does not have a level of specificity. By that, I mean there are no archipelagic baselines which would define the internal and inland, the internal waters between Trinidad and Tobago, because there are no baselines which encircle Tobago, except the outer limits that go around St. Giles Island, Little Tobago, but in the southern part of the island, it is unclear what the baseline will be that will delineate the internal waters between Trinidad and Tobago, because that area is internal waters. And as I mentioned this, Madam Chair, I am also not, it is not clear. We do know the ratio of land to water, which exists in defining Trinidad and Tobago as an archipelagic state. But looking at this definition, I am unable to understand even where Bukuri, for example, would fall. So I do not know. I believe that that needs to be reviewed unless I can be corrected. The issue of equality of status. The present act also, Madam Chair, the Tobago House of Assembly Act, while it is an act and not in the Constitution, as this definition is intended to be, also gives the Tobago House of Assembly policy making over a larger area of the waters than obtains in this definition. So that again is a cause for concern, because under the Tobago House of Assembly Act, the Tobago House of Assembly can have policy making function, subject of course to cabinet, up to 6 nautical miles. Regarding the issue of equality of status, as is mentioned in section 5 of the bill, Mr. Hochoy Charles would have spoken to that, and we from Tobago would have provided a statement, which we are happy is included in the preamble to the Constitution, as well as in section 1 of the Constitution. However, there is a statement which is not there, which is that the designation of ward would no longer apply to Tobago. Madam Chair, we are mindful of the—
That is out completely. That is out completely. We haven't even put it, we haven't referred to it, we haven't repeated it. That is out completely.
Yes, Madam Chair, and is there a reason for that?
We took it out because those were our instructions, that there was no need for us to refer to Tobago as the island ward. There was no need for us to say that it had to be that we are removing that statement. There was no, because we were doing it in a positive way by not stating it at all.
Madam Chair, if I may, at present our legal documents have that construct, because the Trinidad and Tobago Act of 1887, we are aware there's a savings law provision in the Constitution, section 6, and the Trinidad and Tobago Act of 1887 provided for orders in council to be made, and the order in council of 1899 gave Tobago that designation as a ward of the colony of Trinidad and Tobago. That was never repealed as far as I am aware. And up to today, our legal documents, as we are called upon to write that this parcel of land is situated in Delaford in the parish of St. Paul in the ward of Tobago. I mean, attorneys at law have become creative and we write the island ward. Sometimes we leave out the word ward, but the legal construct is that we are an administrative ward of Trinidad and Tobago. I can be pointed to the repeal of that, Madam.
Sorry, okay, I understand what you're saying. So we will resolve that.
I'm much obliged, Madam. Madam, another area of concern is the parameters of the 4th schedule, the lawmaking function, as well as the 5th schedule, the policy-making function. Within the policy-making function, Madam Chair, there are areas which are omitted, which are a cause for concern, because at present in the Tobago House of Assembly at the 5th schedule, these areas are there in terms of policy making. For instance, the issue of ports and airports, the issue of state lands in Tobago, they are not included here. We note also the specific mention in terms of policy making that the Office of the Premier, there's policy making there, but it excludes the Children's Authority of Trinidad and Tobago. Well, one can be hopeful that a memorandum of understanding would be able to allow for harmony, but children are part of a family structure, and our social workers who work generally in Tobago, while there's the Children's Authority, they also are often have a role to play, because where there are referrals, quite often vulnerable groups can fall between a crack in terms of vulnerability reduction. Maybe this can be reviewed. With regard to the
we can look at that.
Yes, with regard to the lawmaking function in the 4th schedule, again, it is anticipated that certain areas might be in need of review, because, Madam Chair, the purpose of autonomy is to be able to reposition Tobago on a higher trajectory for development. And looking at the lawmaking function, the factors of production are not included there. In fact, and I don't want to compare to say that the bill which was submitted is better or not, but I am just in terms of the consultative process. The previous bill would have indicated that the schedule should include the areas which the central government would retain control over, and for which the Tobago Island government would not have lawmaking function. However, in this bill, the areas, Tobago then is given the power to make laws for a limited number of areas rather than excluding. So it's exclusionary in definition rather than inclusive. And at the same time, the perspective is towards an orientation of autonomy. So again, maybe, I do not know if the Joint Select Committee would want to review that so that the wishes of the people of Tobago could be given greater, could be reviewed. At this point in time, I will rest and the political leader can speak to other areas.
Could you ensure that we get your suggestions in writing? You can send it to the committee, please.
Yes, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you very much for the submission, Legal Counsel. And just to add to the queries that we have arising from the bill as presented to us, in addition to the definition of Tobago, in addition to the challenges with the 4th and 5th schedule, we have reasoned that under the rubric or under the category of fiscal independence for Tobago, there are some areas that we need clarification on as well. And when the people of Tobago looked at this aspect, which we consider to be very important for us, we took into consideration a number of different areas. And those would have been the physical separation of Tobago, the isolation from the growth centers, the absence of the multiplier effect of expenditure and investment in Trinidad and not felt in Tobago. And so when those were considered, we take into consideration an 8% for the island. And of course, when we look at what is transpiring now, 20 years ago, it was determined that Tobago should have at least a minimum of 4.03%, but with an outer range of 6.9%, as would have been indicated by the Dispute Resolution Committee. And so in 2021, 20 years after that act was passed and given effect in the law, we are of the opinion that considering those factors that we would have taken into consideration, that our 8%, which was put forward by the people of Tobago, should be considered in that regard. And so we ask for some clarity with regards to the rationale for the 6.8% that is now included in the bill that we are now discussing.
Member De Freitas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Could I just ask to have that repeated?
We are asking for clarity, a better understanding in terms of how the committee, members of the committee would have come up with the 6.8%, taking into consideration the expressions of the people of Tobago in terms of their submission, which was for an 8% allocation. And of course, taking into consideration the Tobago House of Assembly Act 40 of 1996, which speaks to a lower limit of 4.03% and a higher limit of 6.9%. And of course, that was 20 years ago. And now that we're in 2021, and we have this progressive desire, and of course, the need to ensure that Tobago is developed in a particular way, we ask for the rationale. Why not 6.9%? Why not 8%? How did you arrive at the 6.8%?
Okay, thank you very much. I've got it clear now. So the 6.8% and the rationale behind it was utilizing a very similar formula that was utilized with the Dispute Resolution Commission that came up with the range of the 4.03 to 6.9%. Now, when it was settled upon 6.8%, taking into account that formula, geography, population size, that type of stuff, the idea was that with 6.8% being a minimum, a guarantee moving forward in relation to the bill that is before us, that the Fiscal Review Commission, being a committee that's going to be meeting on a very regular basis with individuals on that committee who are decision makers, that being the Minister of Finance and the Secretary of Finance, that should Tobago require more on top of that 6.8%, that would be put forward coming out of the committee, and then that would be taken to Parliament for approval in that regard. So that is where the justification for the 6.8% came up, but it was never to say that 6.8% is all that Tobago is going to get, because that is not the intention. The intention is the understanding, as you rightly indicated, that as Tobago develops, it's going to need more, and in doing so, the Fiscal Review Commission, with the makeup of the committee and the way it is that another formula could be put forward later on. So, for example, there's a sentiment that you can work out what is the true revenue generating potential of Tobago, taking into account several other factors that have nothing to do with population and geography. But the Fiscal Review Commission and the makeup of it can put that forward by coming up with a better formula moving forward that would properly show exactly what Tobago needs going forward. So you don't want a situation where 50 years from now you're still stuck at 6.8%. No, that is not the intention. The intention is that you start with 6.8% now, utilizing the same formula that has always been there, but the Fiscal Review Commission meets on a regular basis, and that is key, to decide what the popular formula should be moving forward, taking into account a whole host of other factors, so that there's that developmental aspect of it in relation to Tobago.
Right. Well, in that regard, we have a concern with the membership or the composition, rather, of the Fiscal Review Committee. When one looks at the Fiscal Review Committee, it does not give weighting to the membership representing Tobago. As a matter of fact, there are 5 members on that committee. I think 3 of them are representing the central government. And so if it is that those desires are to be adequately articulated and supported from the Tobago context, we are asking that that committee be reviewed. And then the question of what exactly will the Fiscal Committee be reviewing? Is it all sums above the agreed amount, or is it all sums that will be allocated to the Tobago House of Assembly? In this regard, we need clarity on that, because we are of the opinion that the Fiscal Review Committee mandate, as in 23.4, should read to determine and recommend to Parliament all sums above the agreed amount. So could you please offer some clarity?
So it's all sums above 6.8.
And it is not stated in the bill as it is, so we're hoping that that can be remedied.
Okay, noted.
All right. The other area of concern on the fiscal independence for Tobago has to do with the composition, as I said, and the requirement that we are of the opinion that there should be technocrats on that fiscal review committee. And of course, that will give us another avenue for treating with any disputes that we might have in relation to the finances to be allocated to Tobago. And of course, if all else fails, then there should also be an arrangement where at the policy level, there can be discussions, of course, with the Minister, the Secretary of Finance, the Premier, as the case might be. So this falls under the category of the concerns that we have expressed in terms of the composition of the Fiscal Review Committee, the weighting, and more importantly, an arrangement where technocrats can lead the process. And if that fails, then we call into the arrangement or the discussion, the policy makers, so to speak.
So Madam Chair, just to respond, and of course we do take that into account, member of the Assembly, Davison Celestine. Now the idea behind the Fiscal Review Commission was that the decision makers in relation to the finances for both Trinidad and Tobago were chairing and deputizing on the Fiscal Review Commission. And the reason for this is because it was intended to be a running conversation greater than the situation that occurs now, whereby you have estimates being sent down to Trinidad for approval. And during that process, let's say the Secretary of Finance tries to meet with the Minister of Finance, and you're meeting within a limited time frame to sort of indicate at that point in time, while the budgetary process is being prepared for October, what Tobago truly needs from a financial standpoint. The idea behind the FRC is that it's a constant conversation between those two individuals. Now, the appointments by the Cabinet and the appointment by the Executive Council, those could be technocratic appointments. I don't know if it's being taken that members of the Cabinet itself or members of the Executive Council would be the ones that are to be appointed. It is not my understanding that that was the case. The understanding was that you could have appointed technocrats in those particular positions that are not the Deputy Chair and the Chair. But when the entire committee meets, they sit down in a cordial fashion, and because you're having that constant conversation, then Tobago, for one, has the ability to properly indicate exactly what it needs moving forward. And let me say why, too, because with the 6.8% that is being put forward, and when you look at the other financial provisions in the bill, that money that is coming at the end of the budgetary process, so once the Minister of Finance in the National Parliament indicates what the expenditure for that fiscal year is, Tobago immediately knows what 6.8% of that expenditure is. And that represents the money that Tobago is going to receive to do everything. Certain ministries would not be coming to Tobago to build anything anymore because Tobago is now responsible for all of its funds. Once that money is received, Tobago is now responsible by way of its appropriation bill that is going to be passing in its own legislature, its own line item that is going to be scrutinized by the legislature itself. And even after the budgetary process is completed in Tobago and it's passed, you have further oversight functions that would ensure that the money is being spent as was indicated during the budgetary process. So the point was that the FRC was set up so that the two decision makers would be on the committee they would be able to, by way of the cabinet and by way of the executive council, appoint other technocrats, and everybody sits down and they have that running conversation as to what else is needed to ensure that Tobago develops the way it is supposed to develop, on top of the 6.8%.
If I may, Madam Chair, Quasi Devines, I take the point of the Deputy Chairman member, the Freitas. The challenge that we see here with the Fiscal Review Commission, however, whereas in principle, I don't know if you hear me well, whereas in principle,
I'm hearing you. Go ahead.
Yeah, whereas in principle, it would be great to have the decision makers meet consistently, regularly. We still see that at the end of the process, where do we go? Because if it is that in the view of the Secretary of Finance, the Executive Council, Tobago is in a current position, we are trying to develop whatever we're trying to do. And we have the view that at this time, we require a further 8% or further percentage. We want to get up to 7%, whatever the case might be. Even if representation is made at that committee, then what? Because it could still then be up to the commission or the chairman of the commission, who is the Minister of Finance, who still does prepare the budget, to still say, well, Tobago, you still get 6.8% at present. There is a band 4.03 to 6.9%. And I don't know if I may have missed a bit, but there's yet a time that we are to see when Tobago has received anywhere closer to the upper band of 6.9%. So whereas in principle, I could understand what the committee was proposing to be achieved, I am not sure that this vehicle, as it is set up currently, will truly achieve the wishes of the people of Tobago for that fiscal autonomy that we're speaking about.
Okay, so I understand exactly what you're saying, but you have to think of it like this as well. So let's say you have a FRC committee that is fully technocratic individuals, and they produce a report. It still has to go to the Minister of Finance to enact that report. The decision, because it's Trinidad and Tobago and because the laws of Trinidad and Tobago give the Minister of Finance that authority to manage the money, no matter how you set up the committee, the final decision is always will be at the Minister of Finance in terms of how they expend the money, which is why when you have an FRC set up where the Minister of Finance is part of that discussion along with the Secretary of Finance, it means that you have a longer period, let's say 12 months, because this committee is running consistently. And every time you come to a budgetary process, the committee would be able to produce something to say, well, okay, in the next fiscal year, we think Tobago should actually get 8%, 9%, or 10% because of what Tobago needs to build out right now to the benefit of Trinidad and Tobago. But the point that I'm making is that because the Minister of Finance is part of the discussion process, it should, in principle, be easier. Because if the report comes out of the committee that has a Minister of Finance as chair and a deputy chair that is the Secretary of Finance, the two decision makers, then once it comes out of the committee, it's a fait accompli. It goes to the Parliament for approval during the budgetary process. You understand what I'm saying?
Thank you very much, Deputy Chair, the Freitas. I take what you're saying. But similar to what the DRC decision in 2000, the year 2000, that was then debated in Parliament. The DRC again was not a political compilation, but it was still debated. It still was debated in Parliament and adopted by Parliament. With the FRC review, whenever the review does come, I'm not certain that it has the weighting now to go before Parliament automatically. And again, because of the weighting of the committee, unless a minority report is generated, and if there's a difference of opinions of the 3 appointed by Cabinet and the 2 appointed by the Executive Council, unless a minority report is submitted and then presented before Parliament, I don't know that the views or the minority views on that occasion would even get to the light of day. So again, I don't know if it needs strengthening. Again, we understand what the intent is, but we're not certain at this point again that the will of the people of Tobago would be achieved by this current vehicle. Maybe there needs to be amendments again to look at how the makeup can really ensure that there's a true and genuine review of the fiscal situation in Tobago on an annual basis to ensure that the considerations, as pointed out in part 23D, 4D, that we look at all of those things on a continuous basis, because God forbid that there is a natural disaster or so on the island of Tobago, that these things are truly taken into consideration, one, and two, make it to the Parliament for true consideration so that it can be approved for whether it's an increase in the allocation.
Thank you very much. If I could just interject here. Thank you very much, Assemblyman. We have the Minister of Finance with us. Please remember that the Minister of Finance is not a member of the committee, but we sought his advice on certain issues. And he's with us to discuss that issue of the 6.8%. So I'll now ask the Minister of Finance to take the floor.
Madam Chair, what we can do probably, perhaps, is to ask all of our questions under the category of fiscal independence and allow the Minister to respond, because there are a few more considerations.
What we asked the Minister of Finance to talk about was the 6.8%.
Okay.
Thank you. Minister of Finance.
Hello, are you all hearing me?
Yes, we are.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Could I get some sort of understanding of who I am speaking to? Because I have
members of the committee, and before us are stakeholders.
Yes.
And those are stakeholders in Tobago. And
yes.
The question is being asked by the members of the PNM, who are Tracy Davidson Celestin, Mr. Devines, Ms. Melville. We also have Orville London with us, Stanford Calendar, Ayana Webster Roy. I don't think I've left, I'm hoping I haven't left out anyone. And we also have Chief Secretary Ansel Dennis with us.
Okay, fine. So essentially the participation today is by persons representing the PNM and the committee.
No, let me also say that this is a virtual consultation, so there would be other persons who are hearing what we are saying.
Understand.
Because it's a public consultation. And we also had members of the PDP earlier and Mr. Ho-Choi Charles and his team earlier. We started at 10:30.
Okay, but it's virtual so that members of the public can look at it.
Yes, it's virtual, so members of the public are hearing. We're also on the Parliament channel, and we're also on other platforms.
Thank you.
So please go ahead, Minister of Finance, to discuss the 6.8%.
Sure. In order to establish some sort of scientific basis for determining what percentage of the national budget should be made available to Tobago in its new configuration, we looked at a number of factors. Two primary factors would have been population size and land mass. If you use either of them, you're going to get a percentage that is a little over 5%. We eventually settled on 5.8, which we felt was most representative. It was the highest of the percentages received when you examine factors such as population size and land mass. We then felt that because Tobago is an island and there would be expenses or expenditure in Tobago or costs that would be incurred in Tobago in the management and administration of the Tobago internal government, for want of a better word, that we should add an additional 1%. So the 6.8 is very simply derived. It is using scientific principles, looking at population, looking at land size, and then considering the fact that Tobago is an island. So that's how we came up with 6.8. It's 5.8 plus 1. Now, I was listening to some of the conversation, and I can respond to some of the issues raised. The 6.8, as you can see, was very simply determined based on very simple parameters. However, as time goes by and the new Tobago administration gets more and more involved in its work and build its capacity, increases its establishment, its bureaucracy, its infrastructure, as the case may be, then certainly that percentage would have to be revisited. And this is what is anticipated by that institution that the Deputy President of the Senate was referring to. It's envisaged that a very comprehensive and holistic examination would be made from time to time as the new Tobago administration takes on more and more responsibility for its own internal affairs. At this point in time, the central government does provide, I would say, quite significant services within Tobago through the statutory authorities and so on. And we expect as time goes by that all of that will be subsumed either partially or wholly within the new Tobago administration. And then one would expect there would be a revisiting of the percentage and the allocation as the case may be. Of course, if something happens, you know, God forbid, a terrible hurricane comes down and you know, causes devastation, then that is another reason, another trigger to revisit the situation and see whether additional allocation or additional funding can become available. That's it in a nutshell, and I'm here to answer any questions that I can.
Thank you very much for the clarity.
Thank you very much, Minister.
Well, it seems you have no questions. This
Yes.
is good. Okay, then. Enjoy.
Thank you very much.
Right,
I have a question to the Minister. Minister
Someone
is
has
still
a
on.
question?
Yes.
I thought we had no questions.
No, so Minister Imber, thank you very much, Madam Chair, through you. I heard you mention that we took into consideration the size of the island population. Were there any other factors that you took into consideration?
We looked at land mass, the land area of Tobago, 300 square kilometers, as compared to the total land mass of Trinidad and Tobago, which is just over 5,000 kilometers. That's one factor. Because you could approach this exercise in different ways. So we said, let's look at land size, and that yielded a particular percentage. Then we said, let's look at population, and that yielded another percentage. And at the end of the day, we decided to use the highest percentage that would be derived from that scientific approach. That gave the 5.8. And then we added a further 1% in consideration of the fact that Tobago would have certain unique expenses because of the fact that it's an island.
Just thank you very much for the clarity, but just to add, Minister, I don't know if you're aware, under this particular part of the bill, which is section 23(4), and part D in particular, it goes beyond just land mass, but it actually speaks to factors such as the physical separation of Tobago by sea from Trinidad, the isolation from principal national growth centers, the absence of the multiplier effect of expenditures and investments made in Trinidad, restricted opportunities for employment and career fulfillment, and 5, the impracticability of participation by residents of Tobago in the major educational, cultural, and sporting facilities located in Trinidad. So what the bill in itself, although the Ministry of Finance took into consideration land mass, the bill actually outlines other factors that should have already been taken into consideration or should be taken into consideration by the FRC. So as a matter of fact, if this bill is passed tomorrow, Honorable Minister, then we will already be asking you to review the position of 6.8% by looking at these other factors that are listed outlined in the bill.
Is that Mr. Devine speaking?
Yes, Mr. Imbu, Minister Imbu.
Okay. Secretary Devines, I was very clear. When you use factors such as landmass, you get 5.8%. The other factors that you have listed there contributed to the additional 1%, taking it to 6.8%.
That wasn't the impression, but thank you for indicating that those factors account for 1%. Thank you very much, Minister.
No, well, we don't know exactly what the factors will account for under the new and improved administration. So this is an initial allocation of an additional 1% to take care of those factors of which you spoke. Obviously, as I said, as time goes by and the new administration starts to do its work and take on the additional responsibilities, then that additional 1% would have to be the first thing that would have to be examined. But at this point in time, we felt it appropriate to add that additional 1%.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. We appreciate your intervention.
Oh, my pleasure. And
Thank
good
you.
afternoon to all.
Assemblyman Devines, you were on the floor.
Oh, thank you very much. I think the political leader had some other questions as it regards the FRC, Madam Chair. So I'll pass on to the political leader.
Yes, so as we continue the discussions, there are other areas that we have highlighted as concerns, and that has to do with one part of the role and responsibility of the Fiscal Revenue Review Commission, which speaks to the internal audit functions, rather. This is C, 4C, 22, 4C, which speaks to initiate special audits into any financial matter of the Tobago Island government. Our view is that the Tobago House of Assembly has already established audit systems. As a matter of fact, we have the internal audit arrangement. We also have the Auditor General that will call very regularly on the Tobago House of Assembly systems. And of course, that is easily regarded as an independent arrangement. And apart from that, within this draft Tobago Island bill, as well as within the present arrangement of the current Tobago House of Assembly Act 40 of 1996, it speaks to a number of different committees that will cause the accounts of the Tobago House of Assembly to be audited on a regular basis. And so we took issue with the fact that given that the people of Tobago are asking for financial independence, that there is included in the responsibilities of the Fiscal Review Commission a line or clause that says you will initiate special audits into the financial matters of the Tobago House of Assembly. And we ask for that to be removed from the bill.
Assemblyman Tracy Davidson Celestin, it would be the Fiscal Review Commission that would be making that kind of recommendation. And please understand that as it stands now, there is a provision for special audits that exists for the central government. So what this does is just mirror that ability of the Fiscal Review Commission to be able to recommend special audits apart from what already exists as you outlined it. Because that is normal in terms of making sure that financial issues are properly dealt with. special audits.
But in the context of what we are attempting to achieve, which is greater autonomy for the people of Tobago, and in certain respects, greater financial independence for the people of Tobago, we are of the view that including a special audit arrangement into this particular role and responsibility for the Fiscal Review Committee seeks to endorse the view by Tobagonians that there will be dominance of the cabinet as well as the parliament in the affairs of the people of Tobago.
All right, we will look at it. You want to move on from that?
Yes, and
Thank you.
apart from that, the bill is silent in terms of how funds are to be remitted to the Tobago House of Assembly. And so we wish to have included in the bill the expressions of the current Tobago House of Assembly Act, which speaks to the Tobago House of Assembly receiving its resources in quarterly payments. And if you were to look at section 47 of the current Tobago Act, it spells that out, it expresses it very nicely.
We will take advice from the Ministry of Finance in that regard.
The Department of Treasury, a Department of Treasury in Tobago is also recommended to treat with the need for documentation, such as the assessment of pensions and gratuity on this island. Far too often, we find that all of those documentation must go to Trinidad to be processed, and it takes an inordinate length of time to treat with issues of gratuity, to treat with issues having to do with pensions for the people of Tobago. And so we're asking for an expression with regards to the Department of Treasury be included in the bill.
Okay, could I just point out that in accordance with the 5th schedule, you would see where we have 5th schedule, item 5, everything in relation to finance except for banking, borrowing, external borrowing, foreign exchange and exchange control, customs and excise, taxation, financial intelligence, and national insurance will be dealt with by Tobago. So that would be covered there.
All right, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Other concerns?
Composition of the Tobago Legislature. The Tobago Legislature comprises, of course, the President and the House of Assembly. And of course, the House of Assembly, as per your document, comprises assemblymen and councillors, as well as the presiding officer and the deputy presiding officer. But there are certain areas in reading the document which can be easily queried on how it was drafted. And it has to do, one, with the question of who selects the presiding officer. And in the document, or who elects rather the presiding officer, and that should be made clear. Is it the House of Assembly comprising councillors and assemblymen, or is it the assemblymen solely? That is not clear in the document, because if you were to read on and you were to follow, councillors are selected later on after the minority leader. And which is after the 3 days required for swearing in of the members of the assembly. And then the question of who is sworn in 3 days after.
Sorry, Assemblyman, if you look at in the Constitution Amendment at 141E, subclause 2, that is clear there. It says when the House of Assembly first meets after the election and before it proceeds to the dispatch of any other business, except the election of the president, the House shall elect sorry, it's 141E1. When the House of Assembly first meets after the election and before it proceeds to the dispatch of any other business, it shall elect a person to be the presiding officer of the House of Assembly, and if the office of the presiding officer falls vacant, the House of Assembly shall, as soon as practicable, elect another person to that office.
But the thing is, the House of Assembly, when the House of Assembly first meets after the election, the House of Assembly here is defined as assemblymen and councillors. And if you were to follow on from, I think it is section 141D, it states that the president shall administer the oath of office set out in the first schedule to the members of the Tobago Legislature at a meeting held for such purpose not later than 3 days after the appointment. There is also some challenges here because when you look at how legislature is defined, it is defined as the president as well as the members of the House of Assembly. But if you were to read further down, House of Assembly comprises both assemblymen and councillors, and the document clearly spells out that the councillors are to be appointed way down after the minority leader has been elected. So there is a challenge with the definition in this regard.
You want it to be clarified?
It has to be clarified.
All right, so we'll look at that again.
Actually, in the present circumstances, we are having quite a lot of challenges with regards to the interpretation.
Okay, so we will look at that again. Okay, so we can move on.
Yes, and we can. And the final point in terms of the composition of the Tobago Legislature, we are asking that assemblyman be replaced with assembly member so that it becomes gender neutral.
Okay, thanks.
In terms of the area having to do with human resources, I will now hand over to Kwesi Devine, who will shed some light in that regard.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Through you, Madam Chair. Of course, when the bill was presented to Cabinet with the proposition for Tobago Service Commission, it was to deal with the issues endemic to Tobago of the slow pace of appointment of public servants, teachers, the slow pace of promotions, the fact that the public service did not seem agile enough to deal with the needs of the people of Tobago. The proposition under the bill, which is in the on the start of the constitutional amendment, speaks to the Tobago division having 2 additional members ordinarily resident in Tobago. But we are very unclear as to how this would work, and 2, how you would deal with the issues that were presented by the people of Tobago in terms of the weaknesses of the public service at present. So I don't know if the committee will be able to provide some clarity on that.
Member Devine, explain to me what you view as the concern or the issue that would not be solved by having 2 members ordinarily resident in Tobago on the Public Service Commission, especially given the fact that our information is that if we were to set up a whole Public Service Commission for Tobago, that may create some issues. But give me an example of what your concerns are, please.
Well, thank you very much, Chair. Well, the challenge that we are having is we are quite unsure as to what the operations will be. I mean, at present, there is supposed to be an office for the Public Service Commission in Tobago, which is not well staffed, is not up to date with their database and so on. If, for example, a public officer has to act for the first time in a more senior position, that has to be remitted to Trinidad first, and so on. So we are unclear at present, basically nothing else is spelled out, obviously, in the constitutional amendment as to how the proposal in the bill for 2 members would solve, or how it would work to deal with these issues in Tobago.
Let me say that you have to remember that the bill will not outline all the mechanics of how something would work. Let me also say that the objective, therefore, is to ensure that the Public Service Commission has, as it were, a division that is resident in Tobago that would ensure that that issue that you've mentioned with regard to things not occurring as quickly as they should would be solved, because these members would be resident in Tobago. The Public Service Commission will ensure that there is proper staffing and so on, so that the Tobago issues can be dealt with expeditiously if that is what is needed. Now, of course, in the bill itself, those kinds of things would not be stated. Those are administrative issues that will be dealt with by the Service Commission. But our learning was that the Service Commission was of, and not only the Service Commission, but the information that we got from the United Nations and so on was of the firm view that there should not be a duplication of another Service Commission for Tobago specifically, but that the Service Commission would have an arm in Tobago that would deal with only Tobago issues and would not be stymied by Trinidad and Tobago issues having to be dealt with at the same time. So that was the objective.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. We were really trying to get clarity on how the committee envision it working. In terms of the cabinet and parliamentary dominance over Tobago, there are parts of the current bills that still speak in the constitutional amendment bill that still speak to parliamentary oversight or dominance over the Tobago Island government and cabinet oversight and dominance over the Executive Council. In section 8(4) of the Constitutional Amendment Bill, which speaks to where Tobago Act is inconsistent with the Act passed by Parliament. The Act passed by Parliament prevails to the context, the extent of the inconsistency. And we are very well aware, because we heard you mention it previously, that there were consultations with the former Attorney General of St. Kitts and Nevis on the boundary issues. However, in the St. Kitts and Nevis model, although it is a federal system, what we have found is that where there's this conflict, the nod goes the other way. And of course, it's because the intent of any legislature is to make good law. And it is the responsibility of the legislators in Tobago to do the same thing, make good law for the people of Tobago. So where there are situations where it is felt that the law has been put forward and the law is in the best interest of Tobago, and where conflict arises, it should be the other way around, that the Tobago law should continue to get in line.
Could I indicate that where there's a parliament, which is what is intended for the unitary state of Trinidad and Tobago, that if Tobago makes a law that is inconsistent with the laws of the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago, it will be that the law of the Parliament will prevail. And if you look at the St. Kitts Nevis legislation, you will see that in fact, that is the case. There cannot be a law for Tobago that is inconsistent with the overall law for Trinidad and Tobago. And to the extent that there is that inconsistency, the inconsistency will fall away and the rest of the law will prevail. but the Parliament will continue to be supreme because it is for the unitary state of Trinidad and Tobago.
Madam Chair, not to prolong the issue, but does that mean, for instance, in the existing COVID-19 situation, when the regulations for were announced that the quarantine rules in Trinidad provided that persons could quarantine at their domestic residences? And in Tobago, because we know our context, and we decided to embark on a different course of action. If these bills were law and operational, therefore the inconsistency in the Tobago situation would have been subject to legal challenge, despite the fact that the intention was to be able to more effectively manage the COVID situation.
Ms. Melville, you recognize as an attorney at law yourself that the Tobago Island government will be able to make subsidiary legislation. So if there is an instance where something like that were to occur, especially as it relates to that issue of health and so on, I'm sure if Tobago's situation were different, then when these bills become law, then Tobago would be able to look at its particular instance and be able to make regulations that relate to what is happening specifically in Tobago.
But then a citizen would be able to challenge because there would be the inconsistency, and given that provision, I would still take a further submission in writing, Madam Chair.
All right, well, we'll await your submission in writing. But the issue is that we're trying to make sure that the laws that govern Trinidad and Tobago are not, the Tobago laws are not in conflict with those laws. But we've been very specific in that the fourth schedule outlines very clearly what are the areas where the Tobago legislature has the ability to make laws. But we'll await your submission in writing.
But just a final point from my side, the issue of the mediation committee is, that is another cause for concern, the composition, because the parties to the potential conflict also seem to be the mediators. And in addition to that, if the matter is not resolved at mediation, this section provides that the extent of appeals would be limited. And I'm just inquiring as to the reason for that.
All right, this is one of the areas that we do understand that there has been some concern, and we will review this.
All right, thank you. Outside of the issue of mediation, I want to go back to the composition of the Tobago legislature and to bring to the table the point of the assistant secretaries, which weren't adequately represented in the new arrangement. In the old, or in the current rather, Tobago House of Assembly Act, we have the mention in 37B1 that the president, on the advice of the chief secretary, may appoint members to the office of the assistant secretary. However, in this regard, in this bill, it is silent. Can we have consideration for assistant secretaries in this current arrangement?
Could you repeat? I'm not sure I understood exactly what you said. Can you repeat, please?
We are talking about the mention of assistant secretaries in the bill. In the current Tobago House of Assembly Act, section 37B1 speaks to the President, on the advice of the Chief Secretary, appointing a member to the office of the Assistant Secretary. However, in this bill, there is no mention of Assistant Secretaries.
Okay, no problem, Member Assemblywoman Tracy Davidson Celestine. If that is the case, then we would review it and make the necessary adjustments.
Deputy Chair, if I may.
Sure, go ahead.
There was an issue as well, as I spoke before, about Parliament dominance, of cabinet dominance that we have to address, which was one of the vexed issues for the people of Tobago as well. There was always a concern of Section 75(1), and of course, in Section 25 of the current Act, 25(1) speaks to, without prejudice to Section 75(1) of the Constitution. However, the constitutional amendment here in 75(1)(b) creates an area of concern for us that we would like to be addressed. It reads, in relation to Tobago, no responsibility for the matter set out in the fifth schedule unless there is an emergency or unforeseen circumstance requiring the intervention of the cabinet. And we're saying there that it's there's some vagueness in that, and it may be subject to misinterpretation in the future. And we would like to get some more tightness in that, because it still leaves a window open for cabinet dominance, which has been one of the things that Tobagonians have been very clear that they would like to see removed in this new arrangement.
Okay, so I understand where you're coming from, but the interpretation of that has to be taken into context of what occurs now. So Tobago, as far as I understand, has its own emergency management authority, which, as far as I am aware, is #1 in the Caribbean. There's no other to beat it. So when you take that into context and you read what you just read out, it would essentially mean in an emergency situation where Tobago cannot treat with that emergency and therefore would require intervention of the cabinet. It's not meant as a scapegoat or a caveat to say that the cabinet could just declare emergency on its own and then take over. That's not the case. There is a management authority in Tobago, like I said, which is bar none. It's very good. And it is only in a situation where an emergency arises, and just for example, if a hurricane passes and completely flattens all of Tobago, then obviously Tobago can't deal with that type of emergency. It would require some sort of intervention from an outside entity to come in and assist. And so that is the context that is in. It's not meant in any way for cabinet to have any kind of, scapegoat clause to be able to come in and then say, well, there's an emergency when there's none, and therefore have control. That's not the intent. But I hear what you're saying, and if it needs to be reworded more specifically to say what I've just said, then we'll take that into account, Member Devines.
Yes, please. Thank you very much, because there's still very much concern because we don't know what an unforeseen circumstance, how do we define that? And again, even if there's a, God forbid again, that there's a natural disaster in Tobago, unless that it also took out the lives of the Premier and everyone else, we still have legitimate decision makers on the island. And if there has to be collaboration, then let's say that there will be collaboration. But to say that cabinet can now make decisions now because there's an emergency or an unforeseen circumstance, I think that is something that we have to protect against. And I think it will be a bit of dereliction of duty if we did not represent that, because it's one of the things I can recall very clearly that Tobagonians were up against. Section 25(1), as I said, which speaks to 75(1) of the Constitution. So we would really like that to be reevaluated.
Okay, Member Devine. So we will, like I said, it was not the intention to have it as a scapegoat for anybody to come in and undermine the authority that is invested in the Executive Council. It was really a situation where an emergency is so grave that outside intervention would be needed. But like I said, if it's being interpreted the way that you're saying, then we can surely take a look at it to see how it could be worded to read and be interpreted the way it's supposed to be. Any more concerns?
Well, not on that particular issue, but on the issue of the definition of Tobago. I don't think that we had adequately discussed that. And there was no response from the members of the committee with regards to how you would have come up with the proposal as listed in the Act on the definition of Tobago, because when you look at our Act, which the legal counsel would have pointed out, it speaks to 6 nautical miles. And when we look at what is put forward, we are seeing a more, retrograde step in terms of how Tobago is defined. And so if we're talking about autonomy, we're talking about determination, to our mind, a more progressive approach must be taken into consideration. And of course, that must take into account a greater share of the maritime resources for the people of Tobago. And in that regard, we would have advanced, we would have expressed that 12 nautical miles to be considered. Of course, we're not disregarding the international laws, the international rules and regulations, but we're looking for an internal arrangement between Tobago and Trinidad that can give us, the people in Tobago, the assurance, the comfort that we can treat with these issues as described.
Thank you again, Assemblywoman Tracy Davison Celestin. So we've been sitting in this consultation since 10:30, and that particular issue came up from several stakeholders that appeared before the committee, which led to a very robust discussion between the Attorney General and those particular stakeholders. No fault of you guys, because obviously you're coming at this particular point. But just to summarize what was discussed, is that the committee invited those stakeholders to sort of, put in writing their recommendations as to a middle ground that could be achieved, taking into account the learnings that the committee would have received from various individuals, both internationally and locally. So we're not saying that we're not going to take it on board. What we're saying is that we need to come up with a middle ground. And if you could put in writing sort of a proposed model as well as to how that middle ground could be achieved, taking into account all of the learnings that you guys would have had, and we will take into account the learnings that the committee has received and try to come up with a middle ground in relation to that particular issue.
Thank you very much, Deputy Chairman and Member De Freitas, because I think it's, and I guess it can't be understated what Ms. Melville did indicate, that if you were to look at the archipelagic baselines for Trinidad and Tobago, none exist for Southwest Tobago. So whereas you may have baselines that go around Marble Island, Little Tobago, there are none around Little Tobago. And of course, in the context of possibly preserving our fishing stock, marine parks, and so on, we would want to ensure that the builders take those things into consideration. So we will submit in writing, but just to say that, of course, what currently exists definitely can't go forward given the shortcomings that have been identified.
Well, thank you very much for that. Just to say too, that we will also take on board, as we have been doing, the advice of the constitutional experts, and that was the advice that we relied upon. And the advice generally was that it is not advisable and it is impractical to divide the waters of a unitary state. In addition to that, the practice in international law does not support this, and the archipelagic states do not divide the waters between their regions or islands. But as my colleague said, please submit what you are thinking, and we will examine it, and then we will take advice in terms of how this can be done. Are there any other issues that you wanted to raise? Anybody on your team wanted to raise any other issues? Member Tracy Devines? Tracy Devines, sorry. Member Davidson Celeste. I have been here since 10 o'clock, so I'm definitely...
Make any,
Member
comments?
Davidson Celestin, I don't know if there was anything else you wanted to raise. And if you do have a Tracy Devines there, she could raise.
There is no Tracy. Only Tracy Davidson Celestine. I'm not so sure if there are any other comments from any of the members at this time.
I think that's okay.
Okay, so I'd like to thank you very much for your interventions today. I'd also like to remind you that we're expecting you to send us certain issues that you've raised in writing. And we want to thank you for participating in this robust consultation, and we look forward to receiving your submissions in writing. Thank you very much to members who we did not see, like Mr. Orville London, Mr. Stanford Callender, Member Yana Webster Roy, and I hope I haven't left out anyone. Thank you very much.
And Member Dennis as well. Chief Secretary Dennis as well, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you very much. And we look forward to our continued discussions. And Member Ansel Dennis, sorry. Thank you very much. So we have had quite robust discussions today, and I thank everyone who has participated in today's discussions. Before I come to a complete close, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Mr. Ho-Choi Charles and his team for being here today. I'd also like to thank Mr. Assemblyman Farley Augustine and his team for being here. I would like to take the opportunity to thank Assemblyman Tracy Davidson Celestin and her team for being here. And I'd like to be a little more specific and point out that we had before us today Ho-Choi Charles, Juliana Henry King, Samuel Mark. We had Assemblyman Farley Augustine, Faith Israel, Zorisha Hackett, Pastor Tyrance Baines, and Assemblyman Pollard. We also had Assemblyman Tracy Davidson Celestin, Ansel Dennis, who is the Chief Secretary, Assemblyman Kwesi Devines. We also had Mr. Stanford Callender, Mr. Orville London, Mr. Wendell Berkeley, Ms. Yolanda George Beckles, and Ms. Ingrid Melville, sorry. We didn't see Mr. Kelvin Charles online, but Mrs. Davidson Celestin did mention him when she gave her introductory remarks. I'd like to indicate that our objective today has been to hear from you, to hear the discussion, to hear your input on the Constitution Amendment Bill and the Tobago Island Government Bill. I think we had robust discussions today. I'd like to thank the team that forms the Joint Select Committee. All members were able to participate, and I thank them for being here. As you understand, we have had to go virtual given the circumstances, and I think we still had very robust and very in-depth discussions. I'd like to thank you all for your participation, and I look forward to continued stakeholder engagement. we would inform you that we are on, or we should be on tomorrow. If there are any changes, we will let you know. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Have a very good evening, a restful night, and we admonish all of you to continue to be safe, wear your masks, sanitize, and continue being socially distant. Thank you, and may God continue to bless us all. Please note that if there are persons who wish to register, our WhatsApp number is 722-3270. Thank you very much. You will hear from us. Thank you.